Let's discuss with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who was the chief economist on the Council for Economic Advisors under George W. Bush. He also served as the former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and he's now the president of the American Action Forum. Doug, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start right there.
Sure.
Did it surprise you that Jerome Powell made that distinction, saying that companies or suppliers, importers may wind up picking up the cost of tariffs and not passing it along to the consumer? And also, how realistic is that?
Well, I'm not surprised. The chairman has spent a lot of time in the witness chair, and he's very careful about drawing a straight line between any administration's policies and something the Federal Reserve might have to do. So he's not going to make a direct connection between tariffs and inflation, which would force them to raise rates. He's going to avoid that at all costs. But having, sort of looked at the issue, it is true that in principle, the cost could be borne by the seller, a middleman, or the buyer. But in fact, the vast majority of the evidence is that those tariff costs will be passed along to the American consumer. And so if tariffs are put in place in a substantial amount for a substantial amount of time, and those are things the chairman also emphasized, we don't know how long some of these things will be in place and how big they'll be. But if the president goes ahead with some of his plans, we will see impacts on the price level.
What do you think about what he said regarding the Fed not being in a hurry to cut rates?
Well, I think he was actually very clear on that. Inflation has come down from a high of 9.1% to 2.6, the mid-twos, maybe 3, depending on your preferred measure. But it's stayed there for about 6 months. And so inflation has not continued to decline toward the 2% target. So there's no particular reason to declare victory and cut rates further. Unemployment remains very low. It's at 4%. And he emphasized that they felt that downside risks to the labor market had diminished. And so, again, you're not trying to save the economy from a recession. You still have an inflation problem. Those point toward rates staying where they are being higher than they are going forward.
I mentioned a moment ago that, as you well know, Powell and President Trump had some conflicts in his first term. Trump has been very clear that he sees the presidency as having some role in Fed policy. What do you think of this high wire act that Powell is performing now, where he has to balance what's best for the economy and a president that's very eager to get involved?
I think every administration has strong views about what the Fed's policy should be, and the real difference between President Trump and others is President Trump conveys them publicly more frequently than do other administrations who tend to do this over lunch with the Secretary of Treasury. But the Fed's reaction is the same, which is, we are going to do our job, regardless of what other people's opinion might be. Chairman emphasized that yet again today. The step further of actually having the president remove the chairman or have a say in policymaking, the Fed has firmly said no. They have established their position. For the moment, President Trump's respecting it, and they're just going to have to agree to disagree about the level of interest rates at the moment.
Now, for the moment, Trump has stayed away from the Fed. I want to ask you. Yeah, I want to ask you about something Democrats brought up, this growing concern over the apparent shutdown of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It was shuttered by Elon Musk's Doge. Here is Senator Elizabeth Warren, a frequent proponent of the CFPB's work.
If the CFPB is not there examining these giant banks to make sure they are following the laws on not cheating consumers, who is doing that job?
I can say no other federal regulator.
No one, in other words.
What does it mean for consumers to have the CFPB stop functioning?
Well, in the near term, I think it's exactly as Chairman Powell said. There is no one who's picked up the mantle of consumer protection among the financial regulators. But if you roll the clock back prior to the creation of the CFPB, there were consumer protections in the law, and they were enforced by the various financial regulators, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And what happened with the creation of the CFPB is that those agencies sort of stood down on consumer protection, turned that over to the CFPB. So if the CFPB were to be eliminated, statutorily removed, that mantle would go back to them. They'd have to do that job. Right now, there's sort of everyone's looking at each other wondering, how is this going to play out and who's going to have that role?
So you would argue that at the current moment, there would be no overlap between the work of these other agencies and what the CFPB does, because folks that have argued that it should be dismantled have said that it's redundant.
So when it was created, it was redundant. I was among those who had that concern. But, you know, it's been years, and in that time period, the other agencies have stepped back from the consumer protection role, and they've left it to the CFPB. That's what it was created to do. If there's not going to be a CFPB, then they will have to pick up and enforce those laws and use their authorities to do so.
Doug Holtz-Eakin, appreciate the analysis. Thanks for joining us.